The year was 1540, and beneath the shimmering grandeur of Hampton Court Palace, a nightmare was unfolding that would make even the most grotesque fable seem mild in comparison. While courtiers danced and ambassadors smiled, one woman found herself imprisoned in a spectacle of royal cruelty that began not with betrayal or infidelity, but with something far more devastating in the eyes of a Tudor monarch. She had failed to ignite his desire. Anne of Cleves arrived in England as a bride, a diplomatic trophy intended to fortify Protestant alliances and bolster Henry VIII against his Catholic rivals. What she became was something far darker, a living emblem of royal disdain, a woman whose only fault was existing in the wrong form at the wrong moment. This is not the softened tale of the fortunate wife who escaped with her life. This is the brutal reality of orchestrated humiliation, deliberate spite, and a king whose decaying body mirrored the corruption festering in his soul. Today we descend into one of history's most misjudged royal catastrophes, the story of how Henry VIII turned a dignified German princess into a figure of mockery, and how she endured by accepting degradation that would have broken weaker spirits. By the end, you'll understand why Anne of Cleves embodies not just a personal calamity, but the complete moral collapse of Tudor England itself. Don't forget to subscribe to Rotten Ages if you love your history dark, decayed, and deliciously disturbing. Before we witness the ruin of a woman's dignity, we must understand the monster who engineered it. By 1539, Henry VIII had become something scarcely recognizable as human. The vigorous young ruler who had once dazzled Europe's courts was now a decaying giant, his massive body supported by contraptions of metal and leather, his legs oozing pus and blood through costly stockings. The sickly scent of decay followed him down palace corridors as courtiers learned to breathe through their mouths when near him. Modern physicians studying historical reports paint a ghastly picture. Henry likely suffered from osteomyelitis, a bone infection that caused unbearable torment while releasing a foul-smelling discharge from several open sores. His doctors, ignorant of bacterial infection, could only wrap the wounds and prescribe opium that further clouded his already unstable judgment. The fusion of chronic agony and narcotic confusion created a ruler who was both dangerous and completely erratic. The king's medical affliction affected more than his mobility. The persistent infection probably disrupted his hormones and circulation in ways that made physical intimacy painful or impossible. Yet Henry's immense pride forbade any admission of these biological truths. Instead, he projected blame onto his wives, crafting elaborate self-deceptions that twisted his physical impotence into moral accusations against feminine inadequacy. This was the diseased despot who would soon condemn Anne of Cleves, projecting his bodily corruption onto a woman whose only shortcoming was her inability to repair his shattered virility through mere attraction. Meanwhile, across the channel in the German Duchy of Cleves, a 24-year-old woman was preparing for the role of her lifetime. Anne had been raised within the disciplined household of her brother Duke Wilhelm, educated in languages, music, and the polished etiquette expected of noble consorts. She understood obligation above sentiment, a virtue that would become both her salvation and her torment in the ruthless world of Tudor politics. The political urgency behind this marriage cannot be overstated. England stood isolated in Europe, threatened by the Catholic unity of France and the Holy Roman Empire. Henry's rupture with Rome had stripped him of key allies, leaving his kingdom teetering on the edge of diplomatic ruin. The Protestant German states offered a lifeline, and Anne represented that link. Her brother commanded influence among Lutheran princes, making this union not a romantic fantasy but a matter of survival for a divided realm. Yet even as envoys negotiated contracts and dowries, Henry's personal insecurities were already infecting the arrangement. The once confident monarch was now consumed by anxieties about his fading strength. He demanded endless reassurance of his desirability while becoming less capable of performing the acts that might have justified it. The disaster was preordained before Anne ever stepped onto English soil. The first fracture in their doomed alliance came through art itself. Hans Holbein's portrait of Anne sealed her destiny long before they met. The court artist, celebrated for his unsparing realism, had captured the Duchess in conventional German attire, her face calm and composed beneath an ornate headdress. To modern eyes she appears gentle, but Henry's imagination, inflamed by flattery and his own desperate vanity, saw more than the truth. He studied that painting obsessively, building fantasies no living woman could satisfy. His courtiers, ever attuned to the monarch's desires, exaggerated the portrait's charm with embellished tales of Teutonic beauty and grace. They described skin like pale ivory and eyes that shone with intelligence, constructing an impossible ideal that doomed Anne before she had even crossed the sea. When Anne's entourage finally reached English shores in December 1539, they carried with them the hopes of two nations and the fragile promise of Protestant unity. The Duchess had spent months preparing for her new role. She had studied English etiquette, practiced the language, and even learned local dances meant to delight her royal husband. Her dowry chests overflowed with fine textiles and jeweled ornaments, symbols of her family's wealth and prestige. The fateful meeting at Rochester destroyed every illusion in a single moment. Henry, disguised as a simple courier in what he fancied a romantic gesture of chivalric surprise, burst into Anne's chambers, expecting enchantment. Instead, he encountered a woman who failed to recognize him, and worse still, failed to swoon. Anne, raised within the rigid protocols of a German court, reacted with polite confusion rather than infatuated awe. This cultural dissonance became the first crack in their doomed relationship. Where Henry expected instant passion and obedient adoration, he found composed bewilderment. The woman before him, foreign, unfamiliar, and unflustered, refused to confirm his myth of irresistible masculinity. Henry's disgust was immediate, and witnessed by all. His expression darkened with thinly veiled rage as political duty collided with personal vanity. In that instant, Anne became not just a disappointment, but a threat to his fragile self-image. The marriage would proceed, political demands required it, but Henry's campaign to destroy Anne's reputation began that very day. The whispers started immediately. Courtiers, who had praised the match, now muttered about the bride's foreign habits, her stiffness, her supposed inability to meet the king's refined expectations. These were not spontaneous murmurs, but orchestrated slanders, designed to excuse the king's own inadequacies. The wedding on January 6, 1540, unfolded like a solemn requiem disguised as festivity. Henry stood glittering in cloth of gold, despite his failing body, while Anne wore resplendent robes that could not conceal his visible revulsion. Foreign envoys strained to interpret the subtle signs of royal displeasure, echoing through the abbey's ancient walls. Anne herself held firm composure despite the humiliation simmering around her. Trained in discipline, she understood that obedience could mean survival, yet she could not have imagined the depth of cruelty that awaited her in the English court. This was not a union of affection or even alliance, but the ritualized destruction of a woman who had committed no sin beyond failing to please a decaying tyrant. That night, the royal bedchamber became a stage of disgrace that would define Anne's entire existence in England. Henry, his body resembling a breathing corpse more than a sovereign, approached the marriage bed with the same enthusiasm one might show for their own execution. His ulcerated legs, swathed in rancid bandages, seeped through the silk sheets while he blamed Anne for the revulsion that came from his own diseased flesh. The once charismatic performer who had charmed courts across Europe now found himself powerless before a woman whose only fault was being present at the wrong time in the wrong body. Unable to confront his own decay, Henry built a tale of feminine inadequacy that would echo through chronicles for centuries. He whispered to his doctors of Anne's supposed defects, fabricated stories of unpleasant odors, and hinted that her foreignness had somehow tainted his natural potency. Among his courtiers, the mockery took shape. They began calling her the Flanders mare, a cruel nickname that would outlive them all. These lies, murmured within palace walls, and repeated by sycophantic courtiers, turned a woman's dignity into public entertainment for a society addicted to cruelty. The systematic demolition of Anne's reputation had begun, and it would only accelerate as Henry's condition worsened, and his need for scapegoats grew. The court's treatment of Anne revealed the cold machinery of Tudor malice at its most refined. Within days of the wedding, courtiers who had once vied for her favor now mimicked her accent with theatrical exaggeration. They ridiculed her foreign manners, turning every harmless difference into proof of her supposed unfitness as queen. Even her choice of perfume became fodder for mocking jokes whispered behind jeweled fans. The ladies who should have been her allies turned instead into informers. They reported every imagined fault to Henry's eager ears with the precision of professional tormentors. Anne found herself isolated within a nest of serpents, where survival demanded silent endurance as every gesture, every glance was interpreted as evidence of foreign corruption. Henry's courtiers understood their role in this elaborate pantomime of royal discontent. To win favor from their increasingly unstable monarch, they competed in cruelty, devising new insults that would justify his rejection of Anne. Her gowns were deemed too foreign, her speech too stiff, her demeanor too continental, her very presence an affront to English taste. The transformation from queen to scapegoat was swift and merciless. Within weeks, Anne had become a living emblem of everything wrong with foreign influence in English politics. Pamphlets circulated suggesting that German women were naturally unsuited to English men. This propaganda served two aims: to normalize Henry's rejection and to prepare public sentiment for the annulment everyone knew was inevitable. Even worse than the public ridicule was the private humiliation inflicted by royal physicians sent to examine Anne's body for the defects Henry claimed to notice. These invasive examinations, disguised as medical necessity, were the ultimate violation of a woman who had entered England as an honoured guest. Reports of these procedures were carefully drafted to support Henry's narrative and preserved as official evidence of her supposed unfitness. Henry's doctors, terrified of contradicting royal ego, joined in blaming external factors for their sovereign's obvious decline. They invented ailments, suggesting that German humours or foreign diets had corrupted the king's masculine essence. These conclusions revealed how medical science bowed before politics in Tudor England. Meanwhile, foreign envoys chronicled the king's grotesque decay. By 1540, diplomatic reports described audiences that required elaborate measures to mask the odour of his infected wounds. Courtiers devised formal rules for keeping respectful distance while enduring his stench, and through it all, Anne bore the blame for her husband's rot. While she suffered her public crucifixion, Henry had already fixed his predatory gaze upon Catherine Howard, a teenage girl whose youth promised the renewal his pride demanded. Catherine, barely past childhood and overwhelmed by the glamour of royal notice, became the instrument of Anne's final disgrace. The king's pursuit of his fifth bride began even before his fourth marriage had been dissolved. Catherine represented everything Anne was not: young where Anne was mature, English where Anne was foreign, naive where Anne was composed. Her very existence mocked Anne's perceived shortcomings, and Henry ensured the comparison was unmistakable. Observers noted the king's eyes light up whenever Catherine entered the room, while his demeanour toward Anne grew increasingly cold and mechanical. The haste with which Henry pursued the girl revealed that his rejection of Anne had never been emotional. Henry had resolved to discard Anne almost immediately after their wedding, and Catherine Howard provided the perfect excuse. The young girl's eagerness to please would later destroy her, but for the moment she served as the weapon used to annihilate Anne's dignity. Anne's situation became perilous. As Henry's infatuation deepened, the Queen found herself forced to attend court festivities where her replacement was paraded before her. Protocol required her to smile and participate in her own undoing, to maintain composure as her marriage disintegrated in front of courtiers who gossiped and grinned. The diplomatic schooling that had prepared her to rule now only enabled her to mask heartbreak with grace. Across Europe, Anne's treatment provoked both fascination and horror. The Holy Roman Emperor used her humiliation as evidence of English savagery, while French nobles staged entertainments mocking Henry's failure to consummate his marriage with a respectable German bride. The Protestant states of Germany took the insult personally, viewing Anne's dismissal as a blow against the Reformation itself. Her brother, Duke Wilhelm of Cleves, considered breaking the English alliance and joining the Catholic League, a shift that could have left England dangerously isolated. Only Anne's own letters, urging restraint, prevented a diplomatic collapse that might have invited invasion. Spanish ambassadors reported that Henry's cruelty toward Anne exposed fractures in English succession that could be exploited by Catholic powers. Her personal ordeal thus became a matter of international strategy. Her shame translated into military opportunity. Thomas Cromwell, the very architect of Anne's marriage, was now charged with dismantling it, an irony that would soon cost him his life. Legal experts scoured canon law for convenient precedents, while theologians composed arguments about consent and consummation to grant Henry the freedom he craved. Parliamentary commissions interrogated witnesses whose testimonies had already been decided. Anne's foreign birth was cited as a natural impediment to proper union, while Henry's claim of non-consummation was accepted without challenge. Despite its absurdity, the proceedings resembled farce more than justice. The most malicious twist came when Anne's compliance was twisted into further proof of her inadequacy. When she agreed to confirm the marriage's non-consummation, observers called her overly eager to discuss private matters. When she held her silence about Henry's behaviour, they described her as too cold to understand English emotion. Clergy who had once praised her Protestant faith now found her Germanic piety suspect. Anne's survival, however, was not mere submission. It was strategy. During her brief queenship she had quietly built a network of sympathetic merchants, Protestant thinkers, and nobles, alarmed by Henry's volatility. These alliances would prove vital to her endurance. German traders in London, horrified by her treatment, saw it as part of a wider hostility toward continental influence. Many discreetly aided her through favorable property deals and secret financial assistance, providing her a measure of independence beyond the king's control. Her correspondence reveals a woman far shrewder than history often admits, one who maintained careful contact with her brother and German allies, while avoiding any action that might appear treasonous. It was a balancing act of extraordinary diplomacy, loyal in appearance, yet quietly representing the Protestant cause abroad. Her residence at Richmond became an unofficial embassy where German scholars and exiles sought help, legal advice, funds, or shelter within Henry's increasingly xenophobic kingdom. These activities were so discreet that the crown never grasped their full extent, allowing Anne to construct a quiet web of influence that lay entirely outside royal oversight. The terms of Anne's surrender were unexpectedly generous, reflecting both Henry's relief at avoiding another public bloodshed and his real fear of the political consequences that might follow if he executed a German princess. She would retain the title of the king's sister, receive vast lands and income, and continue to hold a position of prestige at court, provided she never questioned the annulment's legitimacy. In return, she would publicly affirm that her marriage had never been valid, that she remained untouched, and that Henry's rejection stemmed from canonical concerns rather than personal spite. This agreement was a masterpiece of political calculation on Anne's part. She had observed the fates of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, and understood that resistance meant death while compliance offered survival. The signing of the annulment papers was conducted with ceremonial splendor that concealed their underlying cruelty. Anne, adorned in the luxurious garments of her brief queenship, formally renounced all royal claims, while Henry's envoys applauded her prudence and humility. The documents she signed contained humiliating admissions of personal inadequacy and declarations of gratitude for the king's supposed mercy. These forced confessions would become official proof of her unfitness, ensuring that Henry's fabricated narrative would endure for centuries. Anne's humiliation became a warning across the continent. Alliances with Tudor England were as unstable as the king's temper. On July 9, 1540, the same day Parliament formally dissolved Henry's marriage to Anne of Cleves, Thomas Cromwell was executed on Tower Hill. The man who had negotiated the Cleves alliance paid with his life for the very success that had once elevated him. Anne, now safe in her new residence at Richmond Palace, dined peacefully as Cromwell's head fell to the executioner's block. Cromwell's death served multiple purposes in Henry's paranoid imagination. It provided a scapegoat for the diplomatic disaster of the Cleves Union, appeased public outrage over foreign entanglements, and reminded all that even the highest servants could fall overnight. Anne understood the lesson perfectly. Her safety depended on invisibility. She would never again draw the dangerous attention that had destroyed so many others. Meanwhile, Henry married Catherine Howard with indecent haste on the very day Cromwell was executed. Anne was required to attend the festivities, to smile and offer congratulations to the young woman who had supplanted her, adding one final humiliation to her catalogue of indignities under Tudor rule. Anne of Cleves found a way to preserve both dignity and comfort, despite public rejection. Her new status, though born of humiliation, granted freedoms queens seldom possessed. Her estates offered not only wealth but genuine independence, an extraordinary privilege for any woman in 16th century England. She could oversee her own household, pursue her own affairs, and live according to her own rhythms without the crushing duties of queenship. The irony was cruel yet undeniable. Rejection had saved her. Had she remained Henry's wife, she might well have shared the fate of his next queen. Anne's administration of her properties revealed keen intelligence and shrewd management. She negotiated profitable leases, invested in agricultural reform, and diversified her income streams with remarkable success. Her ledgers show a woman who grasped complex financial systems and managed her resources with disciplined precision. She introduced continental farming techniques to her English estates, improving productivity while providing employment for local families who came to see her as a generous and capable landowner. Anne also invested in commercial enterprises connecting English and German trade, leveraging her unique position to foster lucrative partnerships between merchants of both realms. Her financial prosperity allowed for philanthropic work that enhanced her standing among ordinary people. She funded schools, hospitals, and religious foundations that served the communities surrounding her estates, earning popular affection that offered additional security against courtly intrigue. Among those who once mocked her, Admiration slowly replaced ridicule. As the king's sister, she held ceremonial precedence over nearly everyone, yet wielded no real power. This strategic invisibility became her shield. It allowed her to observe but never to interfere in the lethal games of power that consumed others. Foreign visitors frequently remarked upon her serene composure at such events, noting her ability to maintain grace despite the indignity of her position. She had mastered the art of being both visible and unseen, present enough to fulfill duty, yet unobtrusive enough to escape danger. She became fluent in English, capable of handling complex legal and financial matters without translators. Her household accounts list payments for tutors, music masters, and cultural instructors who helped her adapt to the subtleties of English aristocratic life. Anne cultivated sincere friendships with noble families who admired her dignity and intelligence, forming circles of trust that existed beyond her connection to Henry. The Howards, Simers. These bonds provided both companionship and political protection, vital assets in an environment where favor could shift overnight. English nobles communicating with foreign partners often relied on her discretion and linguistic skill. This gave her access to information and leverage that even powerful courtiers lacked. During Edward VI's minority, Anne's Protestant credentials and continental ties made her invaluable to reformist factions seeking closer unity with German Lutherans. She offered advice on religious policy, facilitated exchanges between English and German theologians, and helped shape the ideological alliances that guided England's Reformation. Anne's cautious neutrality during the succession crises after Henry's death showed her political acumen. While others aligned themselves with particular factions and perished when fortunes reversed, Anne maintained cordial relations with all sides, ensuring her own survival as Henry's reign descended further into chaos and brutality. From her sanctuary, she observed with quiet clarity as Catherine Howard, the girl once used as a weapon against her, was arrested, tried, and executed, less than 2 years after their wedding. The same youthful charm that had enthralled Henry could not save her from the king's mounting paranoia and rage. Catherine's gruesome end served as a chilling confirmation of Anne's choice. Submission had been the wiser path. Had she resisted the annulment, demanded her rights, or appealed to foreign powers, she would likely have shared Catherine's fate. As Henry aged and his body decayed further, Anne's standing quietly improved. The king's focus drifted to his 6th wife, Catherine Parr. While the memory of Anne's humiliation faded into an uncomfortable silence he preferred not to revisit. Her unassuming dignity during her years in the background had slowly rehabilitated her reputation among courtiers. Those who once joined in her mockery now regarded her with something close to respect, even admiration. The contrast between Anne's flourishing independence and Henry's accelerating collapse became ever more pronounced. While she cultivated stability and learning, the king sank into grotesque physical misery and psychological torment. The mental anguish mirrored the physical. Once the most powerful man in England, his word literally life or death, Henry now found himself enslaved by the betrayal of his own body. Meanwhile, Anne's transformation from discarded queen to respected matron continued steadily. The economic network she had built through careful investment and management gave her resources that many nobles envied. Her lands were models of efficient agriculture. Anne was building something enduring, a reputation for intelligence, benevolence, and independence. When Henry VIII finally died in January 1547, Anne was more than prepared for the transition. Where many courtiers panicked, their fortunes tied to a dying monarch's will, Anne's foresight and neutrality protected her. Edward VI's Protestant government valued her European contacts and her deep understanding of reformist theology. Her discretion and balanced judgment made her a trusted voice in the uncertain opening years of the young king's reign. Anne's rapport with Mary Tudor, despite their opposing faiths, showed her rare capacity to transcend the sectarian violence tearing England apart. Mary respected Anne's intelligence and diplomatic tact. Henry, rotting in his tomb at Windsor, had become a symbol of physical and moral decay, while Anne thrived quietly in the countryside, the picture of dignified stability. The final years of her life reflected a serenity few Tudor survivors ever achieved. Her private gatherings at Richmond were described as salons of learning, where scholars and courtiers mingled freely without fear of persecution. By the time she reached her 50s, Anne of Cleves had become something few women of her era could claim to be: truly independent. She passed away peacefully after years of quiet prosperity and was laid to rest in Westminster Abbey with honours befitting her royal station. Nobles, ambassadors, and scholars attended her burial, recognizing the extraordinary arc of her life. A woman who had once been humiliated before the world, yet had risen to command genuine respect. The historians who later wrote her story, most of them men, perpetuated Henry's falsehoods, repeating the lie that she was plain, foolish, or unworthy. But modern scholarship has begun to unearth the truth. Anne of Cleves was not the inadequate wife history mocked, but a capable and intelligent woman destroyed by a diseased monarch's pride. The real stench that filled the Tudor court did not come from Anne's perfume or person, but from the king's ulcerated flesh and festering spirit. Henry's story ended in bloated corruption, Anne's in serenity and accomplishment. The revision of Anne's reputation has finally begun to reveal what centuries of Tudor propaganda concealed. Her intelligence and patience rewrote the definition of victory for women trapped in systems built to destroy them. Anne's triumph was not loud or vengeful, it was calm, practical, and absolute. In the end, the grand illusion of Henry VIII, the illusion of absolute power, collapsed under the weight of his own decay. Anne's story remains as the quiet truth behind the myth, that no matter how loud tyranny shouts, dignity endures longer, and that in the vast echoing halls of history, it is often the calmest voice, the one that simply refuses to break, that outlasts them all.